Hello there folks, welcome back to the Chap's Guide. My name is Ash and I am your host on this journey through men's style, self-development and personal grooming. Well, you saw the thumbnail. It says a trip to the world shoe capital, and indeed I did make such a trip just 2 days ago, because earlier this week my business activities involved a visit to the fairly innocuous British city of Leicester, roughly in the centre of England. And on my journey I decided to call into the county of Northamptonshire, a couple of locations in the county, and that's relevant because Northamptonshire is historically the shoe capital of the world. It's where, over the many years that have passed, in the last 100, 120, 150 years, many of the greatest men's shoemakers have spawned their businesses and grown over decades and decades to become the true epicenter of shoemaking in the world today. The likes of the brands which I'm talking about are very familiar to most of you. Well, it was fortunate because I had plenty of time to kill. I was travelling up the day before my meeting, so I visited 4 of the more prominent shoemaking companies in Northamptonshire, and I'm going to tell you all about those visits. Now, my first stop took me to the heritage company of Edward Green's, easy to find in Northamptonshire, just off the main road. And when I first arrived there, I thought, should I bother visiting Edward Green's? It's not a company whose shoes I've ever owned. You don't see many of them around. They're largely overlooked, I think, in the shoe pantheon of the modern era. However, because it was so readily accessible, I thought I'd pop in and have a look around. So I approached their very modern, sort of stylish looking factory. Obviously it's not very old, and although I knew through checking their website that they had a factory shop, there was nothing on the outside of the factory which sort of indicated if it was there and where it was. So when I approached the front door of the factory, I guess where everybody goes in for any business or work, there was a small sign on the door saying, "For factory shop, ring bell." So I rung the bell and there was an intercom system, and a lady said, "Wait there, I'll send somebody down to you." A chap arrived a moment or so later in working clothes. He'd obviously come off the floor where they were producing footwear, and he said, "Oh, come for the factory shop, let me take you through." And he proceeded to lead me through some of the back office functions of the factory. I went through a storage area where there were, literally hundreds and hundreds of boxes of shoes which had been made ready to be shipped or whatever. And he took me through to this area, which was essentially a shop inside the factory. So they'd taken a couple of rooms and they'd sort of done them out on the inside to give the appearance of a shoe shop. There were lots of racks, comfortable chairs, some accessories were on display there, but basically there were rack after rack of shoes which were for sale in their factory store. Now, Edward Green's have been around since 1890, so they're definitely deep into the heritage of the shoe company. And it is fair to say that they are steering towards the higher end of the Northamptonshire shoe companies, because their average pair of shoes is around about £1,000 at full retail price. So we're not talking inexpensive. Typically, they're a cut above some of the other brands that we're going to talk about today. Now, over time, they've been very popular. They've been worn by the likes of Ernest Hemingway and the Duke of Windsor and many other people who are considered to be icons when it comes to men's style. So Edward Green absolutely are up there. So when I was in the store looking around, the chap who'd led me along said, "Is there anything you'd like to know? Can I tell you anything?" So I asked the question, of course, how much do they cost? And he said, on average, about £500 to £600 a pair, depending on each pair, but roughly half retail price. And when I pushed him, why are they so much cheaper? He explained that they're typically, end of line. If they've made a batch for a retailer and they've had some left over, they'll sell them off in the factory, or they may have failed quality control for some minor blemish, but nothing which would render them unsaleable. So a really good price point and an enormous selection of very beautiful shoes. Now, chatting to this gentleman who showed me around, it was almost like a factory tour. I had unfettered access to this guy who works on the shoe floor. He told me that he was a clicker, so that's somebody who actually cuts the leather He told me that in Edward Green, all of the shoes, the leather is cut by hand, unlike many of the other brands who use presses to cut the leather templates out to make the shoes. In Edward Green's, it's still cut by hand. And he'd worked there for a number of years. I think he said it took him 4 years to achieve competency in his skill set for what he was doing. So these are skilled tradespeople who are making these shoes. When I asked him, what are your sort of premium shoes, what is the signature shoe of Edward Green, he told me that their loafers are very, very popular, and their split-toe derbies are one of the ones which they sell more of than any other type. But within the factory store, there was just about everything that you could think of, and some beautiful examples. I mean, I picked up quite a few. I had some detailed looks at these shoes, and you could see that they were finished to a higher level of quality than the ones which we'll visit coming up shortly. So absolutely, very much a fantastic shoe brand is Edward Green. They often get comparisons, I think, to other brands, but Edward Green's very, very impressive indeed. He also went on to tell me that twice a year they normally hold sales within the factory store where they further discount the price of the shoes by 30% or so. So if you imagine £1,000 pair of shoes, roughly half price in the factory store, take an extra 30% off in one of their sales, which they hold twice a year. Not any specific time, it's when the factory store is basically filled up, I think, and they'll decide to liquidate what they've got by further discounting them. You can pick up a pair of shoes which should cost £1,000 for £200 to £300. So a absolute bargain. Now, I really enjoyed my visit to Edward Green's. Now, they're definitely on my radar. I will definitely keep an eye on them. I will absolutely be visiting that factory store again. Having the opportunity to speak to somebody, or to have a gentleman who works on the cutting floor of the shoe factory showing people around the factory shop, was genius, because it really immerses you in the shoemaking traditions, and you feel like you're talking to the guy who made these shoes on the shelves there. If you like shoes, it was an absolute gift and a pleasure to go to their store. So even though initially I didn't intend to, I ended up enjoying that one the best of my visits. Now, whilst I was at Edward Green, just 200 yards up the street, the same street, was the more avant-garde brand of Geoffrey West. Now, I'm not so familiar with Geoffrey West. I've never owned a pair of their shoes, but I'm obviously aware that they are a little bit more fashion forward, and they are much more, trendy, shall I say. But as they were only 200 yards away, I thought it was totally worth a visit. So I strolled up to their house, basically. It's not a factory where the shoes are manufactured, unlike Edward Green, where they're obviously making the shoes at the same site that you're buying them. With Geoffrey West, I think it's sort of an outlet more than a manufacturing point. So I walked around to the back of this house, which is clearly their brand headquarters, and there was a sign over the door, Geoffrey West factory shop. So I went in, and it had been created to look absolutely a lot more like a boutique than a factory shop. Although there were a lot of stock in there, lots of shoes laid out, lots of accessories as well, of all different types. It felt more like a boutique than a factory store, that's for sure. But I enjoyed walking around in there. There was music playing, there was soft furnishings. It certainly didn't feel like a factory. Geoffrey West founded the brand in 1987 with his brother Guy, and they initially started off as 16-year-olds selling shoes from market stalls. They went around Northamptonshire, they bought sort of end-of-line shoes from factory stores and then sold them in the marketplace themselves. They then went on to buying and customizing seconds from other factories until eventually they got to a point where their brand was launched, as I say, in 1987. And they became Geoffrey West, the shoe company, which is beloved by many gentlemen who like to certainly cut a dash with shoes which have more of a personality. Now, they're quite rock and roll influenced, and I would say they're quite Gothic and slightly, Bond villain in the styles. There's a lot of purples, there's a lot of dark colours. And if I say goth, I think you'll understand where I'm coming from. The Gothic colours themselves lend a sort of mysterious and eerie bent to these shoes, and they're highly original. They're definitely scene stealers, and in the factory store they typically sell for between £300 to £500 at full retail price, but in the factory store they were approximately half price. So again, fantastic deals to be had there. Very well laid out, lots and lots of stock, and I enjoyed walking around. Nothing there which tickled my fancy, because as I say, their stuff is a little more avant-garde than my personal taste. But if you like Geoffrey West shoes and you find yourself in Northamptonshire and you want to buy some for half price, less than half price, you've absolutely got to go to this factory store. You will find everything from the collection, from leather bags to the shoes to the boots and everything in between, and at those prices you can't go far wrong. Now my next stop was to church shoes. Do you know what? I ummed and ahed about going to churches because I'd been there maybe 3 years ago on my last visit to Northamptonshire shoe factories. I made a video all about that, but I thought to myself, why not call in, see if anything has changed? And it was on my way anyway, and I'm glad I did, because I called in, parked alongside the huge factory. Church's factory is, enormous compared to some of the others we're talking about today. They, of course, make something like, I think, 5,000 to 6,000 pairs of shoes per week, which, to put that into perspective, Edward Green, who I visited first, they make between 350 and 400 pairs of shoes per week. So much smaller scale, hence the much higher quality and much higher price accepted. But I called into Church's. Now Church's, their average shoe price is edging up towards £1,000. So they're not cheap by any means, but you can get models much lower, £600 and up. But if I was to look on their website and you're looking for a pair of shoes, you're probably going to be looking over £600 to £700 towards £1,000 for some of their classic models. Now they've been around since 1880, even though the factory or the brand itself, the Church brand, can sort of throw its history back to the original Mr. Church, who was around in 1617. But the brand has been on an evolution, culminating in 1999 when they were purchased by the Prada Group. So they are no longer actually owned by the Church factory, they're owned by Prada. And their history goes back a long way. As I say, they made footwear for soldiers during the Second World War. They've stepped up, they've played their part for the country, and their shoes have been towards the top end of the industry standard. When we look at high quality Northamptonshire shoes, we do think of Church's, we do think of Edward Green, we definitely think of Crockett and Jones. But Church's much more prominent in recent years. So I called into the factory store, and it had totally changed since my last visit 3 years ago. When I went into that store 3 years ago, it was very much like a typical factory shop. Shoes and accessories everywhere, everything rammed onto the shelves, lots and lots of stock, little order to the whole schmozzle. On this occasion, I walked in and I was totally surprised, because it was more like walking into one of Church's boutiques, anywhere you might visit one, in London or anywhere like that. Lots of artistically designed shelves and not a lot of stock on display. Obviously their stock is in the back room, so if you see something you like, you ask, they'll draw it out if they have it in stock. So much more like a retail experience than a factory store, which is, I think, becoming a little prevalent in some of these Northamptonshire factory shops as they're becoming more and more popular. Now, an interesting thing, this is a coincidence, 1 in a million. I walked into the store and there was one customer sitting down trying on a pair of shoes, a gentleman. He saw me, locked eyes with me, stood up and said, "Ash?" Now, I didn't recognise him for a moment, but then he said, "I watch all your videos." And believe it or not, it was a gentleman called Christian, lovely chap, who is a watcher of our videos here on the Chap's Guide, seen my previous video on visiting the shoe capital of the world, Northamptonshire, and decided to come over from Germany in his car on a bit of a shopping and cultural trip. As he said to me, he wanted to get a bit chapped up So he was visiting churches. I think he bought 2 pairs of shoes in his visit to the church factory store. So it was lovely to meet Christian. We had a great chat. He was travelling onwards to London, so we talked about visiting Jermyn Street and where to dine when he was in London and things like that. He was going to buy some florists and various other of the traditional items which a good chap always seeks out. So great to meet you, Christian, if you're watching this. Pleasure, and great to see that you've got into the world of high-end men's shoes. So my trip to churches was very interesting in so much as I met Christian, but from a shoe point of view, they've changed it entirely. They now have this almost boutique experience opposed to the previous factory store. So shoes in that store, again, roughly half price. There's a theme here. If you go to a factory shop in Northamptonshire, things tend to be about half their retail price. So great to call into churches, see what they're doing there, and meet somebody, Christian, who's now embarking on a better shoe wearing experience. Now my final stop took me to Joseph Cheaney. This is a brand close to my heart. I own a few pairs of Cheaney shoes, and I rather like Cheaney because they're clearly a good Northamptonshire brand, but they are a slightly more approachable price than, say, Churches and Edward Green. Their average prices are between £300 to £600 at full retail. Saying 300, that's probably taking it towards the lighter end, but certainly 600-ish and above for some of their more flagship products, but £300 to £600. Now they've been around since 1886. Joseph Cheaney has, although in 2009 they were bought out by some members of the Church family. Now Churches, as I said, were bought out by Prada in 1999, and you know, with their Prada money, they obviously wanted to stay in the shoe world, so they ended up buying Joseph Cheaney, and they've turned that around from what must have been a slightly less successful shoe brand into what I think today represents a fantastic entry point for the price into the Northamptonshire shoe factory world. Now actually they're not in the middle of Northamptonshire, they're about 20 miles north in a town called Desborough in Kettering, but it's a magnificent place to visit because you park it's in a street, right? It's an normal terraced street. You'll see the Cheaney factory, and it's a magnificent old sort of red brick factory, houses on either side of it, normal street. Then across the street from the factory entrance there is the Cheaney factory store, which is literally just a house. So I walked in, no other customers, spoke to the sales assistant for some time, and she explained to me they make about 2,500 pairs of shoes or boots per week. They've got about 100 employees in the factory across the street. You know, they themselves, bit like Churches, put their shoulder to the wheel during the war efforts, and they made shoes for the British military, and they have some lovely shoes. That store was much more like a factory store, lots of racks, lots of shoes. The sales assistant was very nice young lady. She showed me some of the shoes, explained about them being you know, quality control failures, showed me actually some of the failures on the shoes just to satisfy me that these quality control glitches were very small. And I have to tell you, you know, they were the most tiny blemish. So if that's your ability to buy a pair of shoes for the reduced prices, for these tiny blemishes, for my mind, it wouldn't enter my consideration. You know, it's a no-brainer. And on average, around about half retail price again. So you're paying half the price for these shoes if you go to the factory store. And if you go to the factory store in Cheaney, there's an additional advantage there, because in the middle of the store, on a plinth, there were shoes which were exclusive to the factory store. Now these have been made by the chaps in the factory and the girls in the factory, and they are unique. They've been made with some, you know, leather which has come to the end of its run there, or they're perhaps apprentices who are learning the trade, or you know, they're an overrun from something else. But whatever it is, these shoes have not been made available. They're not available to the public. They're only available within the factory store. And they had some real corkers there, I have to say. There were some beautiful boots and shoes starting about the you know, £200. And for my money, looking at the quality, the components, the styles, absolute bargain. absolute bargain. Now I noticed, and I asked about it, they were extending the factory store. They were building an extension onto the side, and that is purely to extend the factory store to give customers an even better retail experience when you go there. So I absolutely recommend Cheaney. And the lady said they too, like Edward Green, also have 2 sales a year. They're a bit indiscriminate. She couldn't tell me where they were, but when the factory store is, you know, overflowing with stock, they will have a sale where they will slash the prices. So the secret really, if you're into your shoes, keep ringing up, you know, ring the factory and say, when's your next factory shop sale? And if you're lucky, they might say it's next week or next month. That's what we're planning. They obviously give a bit of planning to it. You can get it on in your diary, get up there and get those shoes for what essentially could potentially be a quarter of their actual retail price. So there we go. That was my visit to 4 of the factory stores in Northamptonshire. There are, of course, many more, and you know, too many to name here. But if you want to see if your favourite shoes has a factory store, go on their website. They're quite coy about it. They don't actively promote their factory stores because clearly they want people to buy their products at full price. But ring up, ask if they've got a factory store and when it's open, because they're not open all of the time. Crockett and Jones, for instance, they're only open on 2 days a week, whereas most of them are open Monday to Friday only. They're not open on weekends because they function alongside their manufacturing working week. They don't operate as shops for reality. They're more like just add-ons to the factory space. So worthwhile doing the research and finding out if the shoes that you love can be yours for a fraction of the price. I heartily recommend it. And for me, going to Edward Green and talking to a chap who works on the floor, you know, we stood talking about shoes for half an hour. He was talking about the manufacturing process, pointed out some of the, you know, the various elements of the shoes to be aware of. For instance, on the split-toe derbies that they sell in Edward Green, they're all hand sewn. They're not sewn with a sewing machine. It's done with a human hand, because it's intricate and it's difficult to form those shapes by using a mechanized process. So it's handmade. And these little things just build your enjoyment and your pleasure in owning a product from a company like that. And I remind you, at one of their sale periods, a pair of those shoes could be yours for as little as £200 to £250, whereas they should cost in excess of 1,000. So well worth understanding the factory shoe opportunities which lay available to you. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video of my most recent journey to Northamptonshire, to the shoe capital of the world. It was a pleasure to undertake it and share some of it with you today. If you have enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, click the red button and subscribe. If you'd like to contribute to the conversation, leave a comment in the comment section below. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can either buy me a coffee or even become a patron. And my patrons receive additional videos about once a week over at my Patreon site, for which you can find the link in the show notes below. So until the next time, take care, and I will see you again wearing your best shoes very soon.